coming to talk about frogs and toads of the coastal plain. Erin's a wildlife biologist in the private lands program with Georgia DNR. Erin, I'll let you introduce yourself more if you would like.
Yeah, thank you, Raymond. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. I hope this is not as clumsy as it feels like it might be as I'm looking at multiple monitors on my desk. So bear with me. But thanks Coastal Wildscapes for inviting me to do this too. I moved to the coast just a couple months ago. I'd been living in South Georgia for the past year, working in a similar role. And then before that, lived in North Georgia for most of my life. So that was kind of a big change moving down here, but I've always done research down here. Hi, Tina. I can see you in the window. But I'll just go ahead. I have a few things I wanted to do with this talk. One of them is just to give you an introduction to some of the frogs of the upper and lower coastal plain of Georgia. We're not doing all the Georgia frogs, but honestly, we've got most of the diversity down here anyway. We're just leaving out a few Georgia frogs by covering all of this. That's how rich the species diversity is down here. So we'll go through that. We'll learn some of their calls, or at least hear their calls, become familiar with them. And then I wanted to give a few pieces of advice for if you wanted to attract frogs to your yard and other small wildlife, provide for frogs and amphibians, other small wildlife. And then just briefly mention a program that I've been involved with for a while that does not exist yet on the coast and maybe it could. All right, so thank you. And I'll take questions at the end or send something up in chat and we'll get to that. So these are the native frogs and toads under Anura, which means tailless. So frogs and toads are both frogs, technically, if anyone wants to give you any trouble about that, they shouldn't. But we do have true toads in the family Bufonidae, and then we have our true frogs. And so that's kind of how that whole toad frog division has taken off in a way. Toads are different here than they are in other parts of the world. So we're going to call them all frogs and toads. But we've got representation from 5 different families here. The tree frogs and allies are in Hylidae. Microhylidae, we've got 1 species represented. The ranids, we've got 8. And then Palobatidae, our spadefoot, is just 1. We do have Bufo and Rana are the genera that I'm going to use for these species, for the true frogs and the true toads. But just keep in mind that you're going to see people kind of alternate between Bufo anaxyrus and Rana lithobates. That's a whole boring talk that I'm not going to give today. I'm not capable of giving that talk either. So we also have, unfortunately, a couple of non-natives that are worth mentioning. We've got the Cuban tree frog on the left, and then the greenhouse frog on the right. I'm pretty familiar with the greenhouse frog. It's pretty common around places I've lived, not now at least, but in more residential areas than in wild places. And then the Cuban tree frog, I don't have much experience with, so hopefully it stays that way. I do have their calls. Let me see if you guys can hear those real quick. So this is your Cuban. Tina, nod if you can hear. Thanks. Okay. It kind of sounds like a leopard frog call a little bit, which we'll hear later, but like judgy or like rude. It's interesting. And then the greenhouse frog, which is a really quiet recording, but it's a really quiet frog. It sounds kind of like a drippy faucet. That's what I hear. They were all over my yard in Tifton. And they became introduced very easily because they're different than all the other frogs and toads we're going to talk about today. They don't have a tadpole phase, basically. They go from egg to froglet. And so they don't need ponds. They get transferred around even in garden soil and things like that. So all of these, this is a nice collage. I have to thank Dirk Stevenson because I'm using a lot of his photos where I credit him when I do, but he also had a nice presentation that kind of helped me put mine together. So thank you, Dirk. I hope all of you have had the pleasure of listening to Dirk tell a story, talk, anything. But he's a great resource and a good friend to have here as a new biologist here. So all of these are predators of frogs. And when you think about frogs and the value of frogs, people want you to always explain your research organism. What does it do? What is its purpose? And I don't usually like doing that because I think it just has they're just intrinsically interesting and deserve to, carry on their fascinating little lives. But also they're super important in the food web. And there's just a ton of biomass of amphibian, just eggs, tadpoles, juveniles, and then fewer, but adults too, that really these other communities depend on to keep them in balance. So when we think about amphibians, one of the first things we learn about amphibians is they live on land and water. They need both of those things. And that's a really simple view. And it doesn't really cover everybody, but it's really basically good guidance. But then once you consider that they just need land, they just need water, then why is it so hard to find certain amphibians in certain places that have both land and water? So that question of why here and why not there is really important. And it's a more sophisticated research question than I realized when I kind of like mumbled it to my advisor in graduate school and said, I want to, explore these issues because it's still a great question and we're still, I'm going to always think about this question. But there are a couple questions that that this leads you to. So the first question is, where are the frogs? And we have to consider that because the frogs aren't where they used to be. They've experienced habitat loss and degradation, roads slicing through their habitat, disconnecting wetlands from uplands. We've lost over 50% of our wetlands in the Southeast. A lot of them are really valuable wetlands, particularly to a number of frogs that are experiencing declines right now. Disease, a lot of fungal pathogens you'll hear about with frogs and other amphibians, invasive species that could be plants or animals, and then climate change. And so then the second question is also, where are the frogs? And so that is basically, these frogs are in different places because of their different life history traits. And life history traits are all of these things kind of above, like your soil moisture requirements, whether they are generalists in what they eat or specialists or in other compartments of their lives. Competition and predation are both forces that can really influence who is going to occur at what type of water body and upland environment. And then a reproductive strategy that works in one type of pond is maybe going to have zero success in any year in a different type of pond. So they're not arbitrarily in places. They're there for different reasons. And it's really cool to try and figure out what those cues are that they are following to end up in those places. And whenever people send me a blurry picture of a tadpole or a frog, I always want to know something more about where they found it before I try to answer it, because it's really helpful. All of these things matter and they go into why these frogs are there. So one of those things that I am getting at when I want to know where did you find it is hydroperiod. So hydroperiod is the length of time that a water body holds water. So a puddle, for example, has a very short hydroperiod, whereas a lake, which is permanent in most cases, has a very long hydroperiod. And so all these different amphibians, they survive they're successful at different parts of this gradient. And there's trade-offs involved. So if you are going to just hop over to a pond that stays permanent, it's available any time of year because it's always got water, right? So you don't have to time your breeding window you don't have to follow like rain cues or temperature or anything. You can just show up whenever. But if you're going to do that, you have to know that there's other predators there. And so you have to be able to survive alongside those predators and have adaptations that allow you to do that, some sort of defenses. And so on the other end, if you are going to say, I'm not good at getting by with predators, I really just need to show up to my own pond I don't want to compete with a lot of other critters, then you could go to a new puddle, something that just showed up 3 days ago and doesn't have invertebrate and vertebrate predators in it, but you're going to have to make sure that you can complete larval development rapidly. So the little critter that we've got here right now, our spadefoot toad up on 0 to 3 months, it can actually complete, it can go from tadpole to froglet in less than 2 weeks, which is incredible. So that is what a lot of research communities have determined, that hydroperiod is one of the primary predictors of amphibian communities and who shows up where and who's successful where. So there was a sort of Goldilocks zone in the middle where it's not too short, it's not too long. And by the way, if it's in the Goldilocks zone, it probably does dry up occasionally. And when it dries up, you know, you start over again. You don't have fish, you don't have even these dragonfly naiads. Those are really big predators, and they've got multiple year development. So you can start clean, but those types of wetlands that have that kind of hydroperiod are fewer and further between. And a lot of them would be described as isolated ephemeral wetlands, but with kind of intermediate hydroperiods. And we've got a bunch of different types here that you can read about, different names. None of us agree on what's called what either. So don't let that stop you from talking about a pond. Just call it an ephemeral wetland. But we'll talk about some of the species in particular that are declining because of the lack of this type of habitat. So when we are trying to identify frogs in an area, one good way to do it is to identify the tadpoles. You go out into the wetland and you dip net and you look, you squint really, and based on the time of year and other things, you can narrow it down a little bit, but it's one way to identify. And this is just a handful of species. There's a lot more, and I've gotten them wrong a lot, and I've better herpetologists than me have gotten them wrong too. So it's not as easy to identify them as it might think. That one does not always orange, for example. Like being orange is more of a response to having predators in that pool. So if there's more predators in that pool, then it would be a different color. So there's just a lot of variation anyway. So another way is through vocalizations and listening to the frog calls during the time of year where they're actively breeding. So males are the only ones that make calls. They're doing so to attract mates and to declare their territories. We've got a couple different pictures here of them, of their vocal sacs, but those are paired lateral sacs up there on a bullfrog. And then we've got down here is a oak toad with a really interesting vocal sac. Up in the top right corner is a frog logger. That's what we call them. We put them out at wetlands, program them to record at certain times, and then later painstakingly listen to the recordings. And then that helps you not have to be out there all the time, but to identify the species. So let's hear this oak toad. So it sounds kind of like little chicks when you're out there at the wetland, and it also sounds like they're little chicks up in the tree. It's very confusing unless you know what that sound is. And that little toad is special. He doesn't get bigger than like a $50. They're really great. So we're starting with our other calls now. We'll start with the green tree frog, Hyla cinerea. Everybody has seen this frog. It's Georgia's state frog. And can everybody hear me fine? I should have asked that like 5 minutes ago. Okay. But Georgia's state frog, really conspicuous. It's got that nice white stripe, which is usually bordered by a gray or black. And then the tadpole is a little bit more aerodynamic than, or not hydrodynamic than others, but that might be a clue as to how it gets by in more permanent waters, because you do see them in permanent ponds. I'm going to try and play you this call here. All right, so kind of like a beepy call. And when it gets together, it sounds like traffic if you've got a big chorus of them calling. So you've probably heard that. And frog calls sound very different when you're up close to it and then when you're coming down a hill or something far away. But yeah. Oh, and that frog, it has a very big range. So you'll find it all over Georgia and the Southeast and further even. A smaller range is the similar squirrel tree frog, who we have pictured here. And it's definitely the tree frog that one of the tree frogs, I guess, that you see by your porch lights at night. I mean, green tree frogs do that too, but they're smaller. They're just like a little bit softer looking than that green tree frog, I know that's very subjective. And they do sometimes they have a white stripe, which you can see on that one on the top left. And sometimes it doesn't go all the way, but one thing that has been helpful in trying to determine them, to distinguish them, is that the green tree frog is green a little bit, that white stripe divides green, whereas on the squirrel tree frog, that white stripe divides two different colors. So let's go up real quick. So even if it's not too much green, there's still green on both sides of that stripe. So try to use that to guide you in the case that they look similar. I didn't pick frogs that look super similar right now, but you will be faced with that. So let's hear their call. Kind of a quack. And they're called a rain frog sometimes. They will start calling when the pressure changes. Here's one that I'm so happy to live near. The Pinewoods tree frog. It does have a narrow range, or a smaller range than the other two, but it's so common around here. And it's like the squirrel tree frog. It can look very different. It looks different in several of these pictures. Its tadpole is gorgeous down there in the bottom left. And there is a frog up there on the top right. They tuck under bark. You can see how perfectly it's camouflaged. And in the top left, it has the same features that you can see on the frog in the middle. Look at its thigh. Those yellow dots on the thigh are diagnostic for this frog. So even if the rest of his pattern doesn't say Pinewoods tree frog to you because, hey, maybe he's silver, that leg is going to have those spots. And even in death, this poor frog that got squished up behind a sign, he's still showing you that he's a Pinewoods tree frog. His call is really interesting. People liken it to Morse code. Where are you at? Yeah. And so this frog and the squirrel tree frog, they're both going to be breeding in sort of way more temporary pools and shallow waters. They don't do well with fish. And so they basically, they're kind of intermediate. They can get things done within about 3 months, larval development, I mean. The bird voice tree frog, I couldn't even find my old pictures. I've only seen them at one site, and even that site was a disjunct population, like not even in that gray, that's their range that you can see there. And they have kind of a strange distribution, but there is another spot where I saw them a long time ago. And it's neat, they sound like birds, but you're out at night, and it's a bird call that would not be calling at night. So that is your clue that that's what you're hearing. Let me see if I can get him. Okay. And those are more commonly found in hardwood swamps and ponds, while the others, you typically find them more closely linked with pine forests and grasslands. So barking tree frog, these guys are great. It's our biggest native tree frog. They're really rough skinned. And look at that, that's a metamorph up there in the top right, and it still has a little bit of tail on it, and that was good size for a tree frog metamorph. So you can see, they're chunky guys. But here's one on the left, we can play a video of this one that I found. It's going to demonstrate a defense mechanism. Before I started filming it, I picked him up in the road, and he was not that size or shape when I did that. I just didn't start recording until too late. Right. So that works to make sure that you can't be eaten, basically. He is bigger than the mouth of a lot of the snakes that were out that night. It was a good snake night. There was a pond nearby, and that's a strategy to avoid getting eaten. A lot of frogs can do that to an extent, but I think the barking tree frog is one of the better ones. And it is a frog that it's breeding in ponds without fish, but you still have snakes and things at ponds without fish. So let's hear its call. So barking, that's a clue. So I think it's written as a donk, 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 but it does sound like hound dogs, kind of. It's usually pretty clear. It sounds kind of similar to the green tree frog call from a distance too, absolutely. The eastern narrowmouth toad. So these are Gastrophryne carolinensis. These are humble little frogs, not toads necessarily in that true toad way that we talked about. And they're usually undercover objects. You don't get to see them unless you're looking for them. I don't have one. They're raindrop shaped. I don't have a good photo to show you that, but that tiny little narrow mouth is adapted for eating ants. And that's what this one in the bottom left-hand corner was doing in a tree in my yard the other night. I don't think of them as arboreal, but it was almost 4 feet up in a tree, and there are notes published that they do that sometimes. And this one I've seen in the tree twice now. So that's another thing. There's just these cool behaviors that you keep getting surprised by if you pay attention. It's got a wonderful call. I liken it to a bunch of sheep packed into a bus. It's pretty good. That's another ephemeral pool puddle, really, frog. Those I think have been breeding in my backyard. They're definitely present all over. And then Cope's gray tree frog, Hyla chrysosceles. This one, like the narrowmouth toad, they've got broad ranges. They're widely distributed, but it's more of a hardwood sort of floodplain type of frog. You don't find it in pine forests that often. And you'll see that's a metamorph from my old pond in the bottom or top left. And then the middle, you can see the yellow on its legs. That yellow is called flashing. And basically it serves, we think, to distract predators. So when it jumps, that flash of yellow distracts the predator. At least you don't see the frogs with bright yellow bodies. Like the meat of the frog is never that color. So somehow having yellow legs distracting them from the body is sufficient. But they're pretty cool. They will breed in puddles. They breed in puddles that dry up and have what we call catastrophic reproductive failure pretty often. But I think they also lay a lot of different clutches in the same year. So it's got a nice trill call. And then southern leopard frogs. These are some of our frogs that move around a bit more than the others. So you are going to see these following streams and hopping from pond to pond, and they've got a good leap on them. Rana sphenocephala. They have a really cool call. So if you recall in the beginning of this talk when I compared the Cuban tree frog to this one, you'll hear that call and see what I mean. It's got like a chuckling part of it. It's also got what people describe as rubbing against a balloon noise. That so let's see. So it's one of the more variable calls that you will hear. It's also one of the earlier calls in the year. They'll start calling in at least January, probably before that. Our southern cricket frog, this is more of a, the southern leopard frog, it breeds in a lot of different environments. So more of a generalist, really. Southern cricket frog it reminded me of him. They both do that. But the southern cricket frogs are really variable. This top left one, I think, was from the Okefenokee. It was gorgeous. But you find all different colors, but they have that triangle on their head. They've got that stripe on their eye, and nothing really jumps like a cricket frog. So you'll learn that characteristic jump. It's a good arc. And down here, is another clue as to how they're getting by in some of those ponds where there's a lot of predators, because they're breeding in more permanent ponds sometimes. And that black tail tip, it's again distracting attention away from the body, the meat of the tadpole. They don't need that tail. They can swim a little better with it, but they don't really need it. So, and that's another thing, you can't count on seeing that black tail tip when you're surveying and dip netting tadpoles, because if this cricket frog ended up breeding in a pool that didn't have a lot of predators, it wouldn't develop that tail tip, which is neat and also frustrating. The American bullfrog, and then I put the bronze frog on the same page because sometimes they look very similar. We didn't hear the cricket frog, I'm sorry. So the cricket frog is close to some of the chorus frogs, but not quite. He doesn't really climb very well. And its call is described as marbles, glass marbles hitting each other. Not a very loud recording, but it really is just like marbles, just kind of not too rhythmically hitting each other. And now so bullfrog and the bronze frog. Rana catesbayana is the bullfrog. It's native in the southeast. You'll hear about it being invasive, but that's out west. And then Rana clementans is the bronze frog. It's also called the green frog sometimes, and the banjo frog because of its call. Not the main difference, but one of the more consistent differences that you can trust between, if you need to distinguish these two, is by looking for dorsolateral ridges, which are ridges that go down the dorsum, the back. So you can see in this bottom center photo by the lily pads, that frog has two ridges that go down its back partway, and then the bullfrog won't have those at all. So everybody on top is a bullfrog here, and then the two down on the bottom are both bronze frogs. And sometimes it's really disconnected ridge, so you have to imagine it almost, as in this one on the bottom right by the mushroom. So they can be tricky, but and then there's also a ridge on the southern leopard frog. Sometimes southern leopard frogs can look like bronze frogs. And the difference there is that southern leopard frogs have those ridges, but they go all the way down to the bottom, whereas these are just sort of partial ridges. Yeah. And let's hear their calls. So you all probably know the bullfrog call. And this is these are both permanent water frogs for the most part. Sometimes you get bronze frogs in shorter hydroperiod wetlands, but they have longer tadpole development stages. A bullfrog can take a year in usually more northern climates, but all right, here's our bullfrog. Okay. Let's hear that banjo frog. And so they sound great when they really get going too. So you've probably heard those before, and they're some of the first to colonize. They move around quite a bit like leopard frogs, and they will come colonize your new pond. I dug a pond and I had those frogs in 2 weeks, I think, after the pond filled with water, after never being a pond there. So this is Dirk's slide because I never see carpenter frogs. I hope to now that I live closer to them. Pig frogs I'm used to. That's a pig frog on the left, Rana grillio, and the carpenter frog on the right, Rana vergatipes. So the carpenter frog is called that because its call sounds like someone hammering. So I think I would have known if I heard it. And then the pig frog sounds like a pig. So you'll see these, well, the pig frog at least in some of the same shared environments as the bullfrog, and even some of those sort of intermediate hydroperiod wetlands, you'll hear them there too sometimes. But they both have longer tadpole phases. Let's get some calls going. Here is our pig frog. Just little grunts, really. That's got some noise in the background, but and then our carpenter frog. Yeah. Eastern spadefoot toad, he is in a class of his own, clearly. He's a freak. He's great. Scaphiopus holbrookii. This is a species that can stay underground for just months and months at a time. I think even a year is something that I've read. But they basically come up when the conditions are right. And this is one on the top right here, digging out of his underground burrow. I think that night we found about 6 of them that were coming up during a good rain. That was really neat. Because they come up basically in torrential rains, but also I've noticed around here, they come out all the time. I see them every night in my yard. So it must be very different than where they typically are. But they're not breeding when they're coming out here, they're just feeding. But they still burrow at night and then come back up because I'll still see them coming up out of their holes, which is great. They are going to exploit really short-term puddles. So they'll all come out and they'll have huge breeding congregations. You can actually you can identify them from a good distance that it's spadefoot toads that have bred because you can see the top of the water just roiling pretty much. I had a video, but I don't think I put it in here. But yeah, it's a pretty neat sight to see all the spadefoot toad tadpoles. And that's another strategy of pooling together to avoid it's a lot of confusion, just little tadpole bodies turning over the others. And it's one way that they deal with being very conspicuous in that puddle. And I'm sure raccoons get a lot of them, but not all of them. Let's hear their call. I'm sorry for the delay in me searching for the calls. It's a little clunky, I know. Here we go. Okay, so he's a favorite, obviously. River frogs. This is another Dirk slide because I've only seen the adults and I've never gotten to see these are giant tadpoles. I should have put a picture of the giant ones in too, but wait until I go see them myself. But they take a long time to develop to become these giant tadpoles too. And they live more in river swamps and creek swamps and things like that, but permanent waters, you won't see them on land, is what I've been told. Some of the wetlands that I've worked in get flooded from the swamp, and so that's probably why I saw them at all. They've got a really cool call. That the website didn't list. So sorry, I didn't check that one, I guess. It's this long drawn out snore. So we'll play the gopher frog call in a minute, and it's kind of similar to that, but it's much longer, like this rolling. They call it like a rolling surf is the description. And then our toads, some of our true toads. So we've got our southern toads, Bufo terrestris, and then our Fowler's toad, Bufo fowleri. It's really mostly terrestris that you're going to be seeing around here. And Fowleri is more, I see it more in the Piedmont, but it is here. It's just kind of hit or miss. So, and the way you tell those apart is by looking at the cranial ridges. So these are just a bunch of cute pictures. Well, cute and gross. That's one on the top left. I'm trying to amplex my foot. There's to the right of that picture, what you can't see is what I describe as a toad wad. It's just about 8 different toads that are all trying to breed, a big breeding ball of them. So if you ever get a chance to watch toads breed, it's fantastic and gross. Yeah, toads are wonderful. They dig their own burrows too, which I didn't realize for a while. I thought they were just using others, but they're definitely digging some of them out on their own, enhancing them and all. It's great. Let's find their call. And toads, they're just like so accessible. You see them all the time. They've got those big parotid glands on top of their heads and backs that are poison glands. So they can just be a little bit bolder than some of the other frogs. I mean, a lot of them are toxic anyway, their skin, but not like that. Where'd you go, toads? So it's a trill, but sometimes it sounds screechy. That one sounded a little screechy, but you can usually hear it. It carries for quite a distance. Then we've got the dainty little grass frog, which I hear a lot of just in my yard too now. They seem to call all the time. Whether they're not necessarily, I guess maybe they're declaring their territory all the time. It seems like they have other reasons they call. But anyway, this is the smallest frog in North America. That is an adult in the bottom left. They do get pretty gold, but that's another thing they can vary. In the top left is a metamorph. It just recently left a pond. I found it on the outside of the pond where you found lots of little ones hopping around. And then on the right, that's its tadpole, which is just a neat thing to keep in mind. The tadpoles are bigger than the frogs when the frogs come out of the pond. That tadpole has to shrink down into like the frog essence, basically. And so you think they're small and then they get even tinier. It's called, I hope you guys can hear this one. This is one that it's got such a frequency that some people really can't hear it in the field either, but I hope you can at least hear it here. And so this is a type of chorus frog, by the way. There's several chorus frogs, and this is the first one we're talking about. Pseudacris ocularis, a little grass frog, and it'll sound like some tinkling, chiming. It's hard to hear. But it sounds like a very high pitched, you've heard it before and you thought it was an insect maybe if you didn't know about this frog. But it sounds kind of like an insect and also winding up. Okay. I will imagine that you heard that. Wanted to play again. Okay. So that was, oh, we have more frogs. We're getting into some other of the chorus frogs, that's right. But I wanted to talk about a suite of frogs that you find that are pretty closely linked to gopher tortoise habitat, or at least longleaf pine communities. And so it's interesting because you'll see on the bottom right, that's a really xeric pine, longleaf pine stand. There's not much, it's pretty much like a desert out there. It doesn't seem like a creature like a frog would necessarily find a way to live. But then on the left, you have another pine stand that is more mesic, more wet on that end. And both of these can be good frog habitats. And it's because they occur along a range of wet and dry, low topography, upland areas that are deeper, sandier, and drier. But they're usually, the frogs are surviving because they're never too far from moisture, or there are burrows on the landscape that they can take cover in. And so when they're using things like small mammal burrows or gopher tortoise burrows, even crawfish burrows, if you're in a wetter area, you can hide from predators, you can maintain a certain body temperature, all sorts of things. You can avoid fire because a lot of these landscapes are fire adapted, and they have to survive those. But another thing you should just notice about this is these open canopies. This is not a hardwood forest. These are open canopies, sunny, herbaceous understories. And there's a suite of species that are in decline right now, and they require these types of habitats and adjacent or nearby wetlands. Here's our burrow builder, gopher tortoise, and then one of my favorite, I picked pictures of tortoise burrows that look particularly pleasant. That's a good one. But lots of different creatures rely on the tortoise burrow. This was the diagram Dirk included, but from, I guess that's Andy Day. I didn't notice until now. Okay. But you can tell it's Dirk's because it's got a bunch of invertebrates and it's focused there, or that Dirk used it for that reason. And in here, frog-wise, we just have the gopher frog that you can see down there. And that's one of the organisms that I researched quite a bit. So here is a gopher frog from a captive rearing program that I got involved with years ago. On the left is a gopher frog with a radio transmitter attached to its waist. And we did some radio telemetry tracking these frogs. These were juveniles. We wanted to see how they moved on the landscape and how they found burrows, because these frogs are a species that spends 99% of their time in a tortoise burrow, comes out to the apron of the burrow, that rising sandy mound around it, and forage for insects, but then pretty much live in that burrow for everything except for their breeding period of life. So when they have to migrate to a breeding pond, and those ponds, as we mentioned, they're going to be fussy in particular, and they need one of those Goldilocks ponds. But here is one of those Goldilocks ponds here, and you can listen to us hear a chorus of them. So you also hear spring peepers in the background. But that snore, that long drawn out snore, is gopher frogs. Okay. And then there's the oak toad. We met the oak toad earlier. I don't have much more to say about it, but I just like seeing its picture again. Bufo quercus. So we remember what it sounds like. And that's one that lives in these, it's not as rare as the other species, but it does live in these xeric tortoisescapes. The ornate chorus frog, it's so related to the little grass frog, but it's gorgeous, obviously, and you've got a bunch of different color morphs that you can see up there. And this is a species that has been experiencing local declines, so they're keeping a close eye on their populations. They have similar needs to other rare declining species like the gopher frog. They need a certain type of pond to survive, and they need to be able to burrow in soil and be close to it. But let me find their call. So it sounds kind of like a spring peeper call, which we'll hear in a bit. I should have started with that, but without any syncopation, really. Can you hear that? Thank you. Okay. And then there's our spring peeper on the top left, or two of them mating right there, Pseudacris crucifer, and then the southern chorus frog, which is more common, and it will breed in ditches, and still in pine communities for the most part, but ditches and then marsh and things like that, I've heard. So let's hear them. Here's our peeper. And it's often the case that if the peepers are at peak chorus, you're not going to hear the other frogs that are out there with them, which can be frustrating. I've listened to hours and hours and hours of just peepers trying to hear a gopher frog in that mess. And then we'll go to our southern chorus frog, Pseudacris nigrita. You've heard this one too, I'm sure. So your finger running up a comb is kind of what they say. And they're early spring, winter and early spring callers, and kind of drags into late spring sometimes, I think. But they're out there calling when it's cold, like a lot of these species that we're just focusing on now. Spring peepers start up when it's cold. The gopher frog, you start looking for them in January. So part of that is these critters are exploiting ponds right when they start to fill, if you think about that, when we get a lot of rains in late fall and winter, and that's to avoid the predators. So we went through all of our frogs. You heard everybody except the river frog, so sorry about that. I will maybe find a recording of that and send it out later. But just this last part I just wanted to talk about really briefly is amphibian habitat in your backyard. If you are interested in attracting some more of these frogs to your yard, there are definitely things you can do. And some things to consider is, what do you have that's already available and maybe is already attracting the frogs, and can you enhance it? So are there drainage ditches or low-lying areas that collect water for a period of time? Do you have a lot of native vegetation, which provides both cover and then also attracts the insects that they're going to need? Is your backyard a dark forest, or do you have sunlight reaching the floor so that you've got a lot of different herbaceous plants? Do you have artificial ponds or farm ponds? Well, farm ponds are artificial. And then look at the difference between this pond on the left and the pond on the right. They both are going to have amphibians, but I could guess which species are going to be in that left pond. And then I would be more surprised by what shows up in the right. The left pond is permanent. It doesn't have a lot of different plant structure, not a lot of place to take cover. And I'm sure it's got fish in it too. So also you'll have to consider your place within a landscape. If you are surrounded by, urban areas, you're just going to have some limitations with which frogs are going to find their way there. But they do surprise you. Some of them are highly mobile. Some of the tree frogs in particular, and then the green frog and leopard frog too. And they'll use culverts and things. They find ways to get to water. So don't be discouraged if you do live in a really urban area. You can still help provide for frogs and other small wildlife. So this next page, I just want to talk about a few elements of how to make a wildlife pond. And I did write frog pond, but really it's not going to just be frogs, but you want to try to manage so that it attracts frogs and allows frogs to successfully reproduce in it. And so what that typically means is that you follow a few of these guidelines. So you need sunlight. They're eating algae and plant material. So 4 to 6 hours of sunlight is good. A thermal gradient is important. So you can achieve that by having a deeper section. Maybe 3 feet is good. You could go deeper than that too, but 2 to 3 feet, you should have a section that's at least that deep. a gradual sloping edge, which we did not see in that farm pond, remember, and that's a really important place for tadpoles to take cover, to hide, and to forage, and then to gradually get out of the pond as they metamorphose. You want to make sure that if you're using a low wet spot in your yard, that it's also not a spot that collects all of the runoff, so consider that. Mostly vegetated perimeter using native plants that, you know, provide different resources. And that variety of plant structure, you can have plants that are coming out of the pond, emerging from the pond, floating on the surface, things like that, which we saw in that second pond on the right and not on the left. And then if you want to have a good wildlife pond, consider not adding fish and not adding a water feature like a fountain, because when you do that, you are really limiting the number of amphibians and even dragonflies and other cool things that would typically you know, occur in an isolated little pool like that. I mean, it's artificial, I get that, but you're creating something that used to be there on the landscape. And so to try to rebuild it in that way, it wouldn't have fish in it. Maybe it mostly wouldn't have fish. We know that now that ducks can introduce fish through eggs to ponds and things. So it happens sometimes. I can't ever say anything 100%. But in general, they wouldn't have fish. They wouldn't have a lot of predators. And then if you add a water feature such as a fountain, you're disturbing that water so much. If it's a small pool, that's not going to be a good place for eggs to develop. If it's a larger pool and you've got a fountain on one side, that's fine. And usually people want to add fish and they want to add the fountain for mosquito control, which I understand. But there are other ways to control for mosquitoes that still allow you to provide habitat for frogs. And these mosquito dunks are wonderful. I've done some research and it really does seem like they're only targeting mosquitoes, black flies, and fungus gnats. They can still lay eggs in the pond, but the bacterium does not allow those eggs to hatch. So you'll want to start out your pond if you're going to build an artificial pond by using these in the beginning, so that you're not miserable. And then eventually you can rely on the natural predators that are going to come take care of mosquitoes. So birds and bats, but also the pond residents themselves that will come your way. Dragonflies are great for mosquito control. They're probably the best. I think little toadlets down there in the bottom right, I think they must eat tons of mosquitoes because they're constantly eating. You cannot keep a toadlet alive, sadly. And then toads up on the top left, adult toads, they're not seeking them out, but they'll eat them. They're hanging out in mosquito-y places and they'll eat them too. And then also remember that a frog pond is never just a frog pond. You're going to attract other wildlife. So try to appreciate it. And this is a picture my friend Rob took, and it's incredible. That's a narrow-mouthed toad in his mouth. And you know how I feel about the narrow-mouthed toad, but I still like that this snake got to, you know, find a meal and enjoy the pond nearby. These are the kinds of experiences that are kind of hard to watch, but also just fascinating. So I also wanted to just take a minute to plug a program that I've been involved with for a while called Frog Watch USA. So this is a citizen science program. We're basically going out there and collecting data about frog calling at different wetlands. And we're collecting data that goes towards a national database so that researchers can use that data to sort of develop, you know, to work on some of those questions to identify breeding phenologies, any kind of changes or trends in frog calling in local populations or broader populations. I'm not explaining this very well, but anyway, you have to have a training before you can participate in Frog Watch, and I would like to see if people are interested in having a chapter or getting a chapter started for Frog Watch, and if so, I can offer training. So frogwatch.org, you can read about it, and they will explain it much better than I just did. But I also wanted to, let's see, what's our time like? Okay, I probably shouldn't show you this video, but you can watch the video on your own. It's called The Puddle. It's by Rob Tiffin, and there's a link down there. And he was he's a frog watcher from my old chapter, but he lives in Florida now. So I think we're both Frog Watch chapterless, and I'd like to change that if other people are interested. So here's some resources. I'll let you go through these on your own time. Most of the calls that I got today were from the online frog calls at the srelherp.uga page. And if you have any questions, I can take them now. I definitely went over.
You're good. We did have a few questions come up, so
Yeah.
we can start from the first one. The first one is, I don't know if you can see it, it's from Kate. She said, green tree frogs are totally gone in her yard in Jacksonville, Florida. The Cuban tree frogs have taken over. So we do have Cuban tree frogs on the Georgia coast. We had one the other week from St. Simon's. It's in my freezer right now. And we've had them on Jekyll, and we had a report the other week from one in Waycross.
Yeah. Are they, these are isolated reports. I realize they're all problematic, but they're not too well established yet, or do you think they're just not being reported that much?
They might just not be reported. They've been on the coast for quite a few years.
Yeah.
So we've had some cold winters. I know Jekyll heard less calls, I think, after one of those cold winters, but they continue to monitor, and Crooked River is starting to monitor this year. But I'm really not a frog person, so.
Okay.
All right. The next question or statement was from Tina saying, yes, many at my house in Darien. I'm not sure which frog she's talking about at that point.
I just got some frogs.
Let's see. The next one is another one from Kate asking about water movement. Does water movement from fountains mean no dragonflies in a pond?
If it's a limited area and that water movement is affecting most of it, then they're not going to have much success, is my understanding, with their eggs developing. That's just too much disturbance. Because when you think about the natural environments where you do see lots of frogs, it's still water environment still. They need that stagnant water, or at least sections of the pond should be stagnant for them. And then you can have your pretty fountain over there, but yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Looks like you have someone who's interested in Frog Watch. So hopefully you have Erin's contact and you can email her.
I should mention the Frog Watch season runs from February through August. So we don't have to get it started this year. That is kind of soon, but we could get training started this year or something if we wanted. And you can join a chapter and monitor at a certain location if we have one, which I don't have one in mind. Or you can just get the training and go monitor your own wetland, which is what I expect people will be doing, because there's just, everyone's so far away from each other sometimes on the coast. Or you could have, you could do a mixture of both. But I'll be monitoring a wetland in my backyard.
Okay. Looks like you have a request to go back to the resources slide again.
Yes.
So I'll have you do that. And then there's another question about squirrel tree frogs are over my front yard porch all the time until temperature drops a bit. Where do they go then when the temperature drops?
Yeah, they are in trees underneath bark for the most part, and even under logs sometimes. Maybe in burrows underneath there, depending on how cold it gets. But you can find them. Oh, well, I can't find them in the winter, but that's where they are, I'm told.
Okay. And then a question from Brittany Dodge. Brittany's the naturalist at Ford Plantation. So if you haven't met Brittany, Erin, you probably should. Y'all are close to each other. Her question was, what is the main species of concern in our area with Frog Watch?
Well, the thing with Frog Watch is we're very unlikely to be monitoring at wetlands where these species of concern are. I know that I would have to drive, well, actually I could probably drive about 20 minutes and get to one, but that's not as convenient for me as the one in my backyard. So it's not necessarily data that's being used for the sensitive species, but more the common species, and coming up with trends that we can, it's hard to study the rare endangered species, but the species that have approximate needs similar to them, some of those we can learn more about those. But really we're just collecting any data about frogs with Frog Watch. Was that the question? It was about Frog Watch, right?
It was. You got it. do y'all have any other questions? I guess since I deal with invasive species, I was going to bring up, we did have a brief period of time where we were getting some reports of cane toads. And so there was a cane toad that was being sold at a pet shop in Kingsland, Georgia. And so we had our law enforcement folks go down and take care of that, because you have to have a permit to have one, and they're really not supposed to be sold. But we also had a couple found in that St. Mary's area. So I don't know if it's related to people purchasing frogs, but
Yeah.
they're both in a jar in my office right now. And we've had no other reports, but definitely, I think, at least I'm concerned about invasive reptiles moving up this way.
We don't think that they can successfully breed here. I don't think, but who knows, especially with climate change, we always have to add that.
Right.
But do we know if are the Cuban tree frogs breeding?
I think they must be.
Okay.
Yeah. But again,
they do seem to be breeding. I think some of it is just that people aren't aware which frog is which. Mm-hmm. And we see this with Mediterranean geckos as well, where people don't know that it's, that it's something that's not supposed to be there. And
right.
It's difficult to get the outreach out about invasives and the problems, and Eamon certainly can appreciate that.
Yes, definitely. So there's another question from Kate. So IFAS has an I've Got One program for reporting invasive species. So Georgia does have a similar program. So it was called SEEDN, SEEDN. It's an app through the invasive species monitoring program out of Tifton. They're now just called EdMap. So you can download a app to your phone for reporting invasive species. So it's EDDMAPS. So it's a UGA run invasive species distribution mapping project. So you can download it, or you go to the website and just sort of submit things that way. You kind of have to create a profile, and the records kind of get tagged to your name, and so you have a history of your reports.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for filling in those gaps. I'm new to the coast, so this is all helpful for me too. And are there any more questions?
Erin, just to put an idea out, well, I first wanted to say thank you for the talk. That was fantastic.
Wait, sorry, Kimberly, because my computer is about to die. I just wanted to walk it over to a power source.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to make sure I thanked everybody before my computer died on me. But I think just casually walk over here. But go ahead and talk.
Well, Katie Higgins, who's the volunteer coordinator at Marine Extension Georgia Sea Grant, she was the one that mentioned Frog Watch, but we also have Adopt a Wetland, and I'm wondering if some of these programs we can build off of each other, and if we have volunteers going out for Adopt a Wetland, we could also pull them in with Frog Watch, and then we can flag those species like Cubans that we're really wanting people to keep an eye out for, and then we tie into SISMA as well.
Yeah, no, that's all what I hoped would happen. I'm really glad you're here and are talking about that. That sounds great, and I'll email you separately about that, because I do need somebody else to sign on to start a chapter, and I've had 2 people say they'll do it, but they're not like necessarily super passionate about that because they're just very busy with other things. So maybe we can talk about that, Kimberly.
Okay, great.
And so there's another question about, is this PowerPoint going to be available to download? So we did record this this Zoom meeting. Unfortunately, I missed the first couple of minutes for some reason. I thought I hit record, but I didn't. So the first couple of slides might be missing. It's also on Facebook Live, and I think it just maintains a record on our Coastal Wildscapes Facebook page. So I think you can rewatch it there as well.
And also, I'm sorry I wasn't able to, you won't have the recordings to go along with it. I mean, you'll have to listen to it. You can't just like flip to the page and hear the recording. You'll have to listen to me talk through it, I guess. But those resources that I listed can help you match up the frog calls without having to hear the whole presentation. And also there's a frog call CD that Georgia DNR is still selling, I think, but it's how most of us, I think, learned our frog calls. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you again. Hopefully maybe in the post-COVID world, we can someday do an actual field trip with people and get out in the field with you if you're open to that.
I'd love it. Yeah. And thank you all for bearing with me in my technical weirdness over here with the monitors, but I had fun, and sorry I went over a little bit, but thanks again for having me on here.
Yeah.
And my contact information is here too if anybody needs that, but I'm working out of the NRCS Richmond Hill office, but mostly from my home office these days, but anyone can reach out. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you again. Everyone have a good evening.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night.